What would you do if sharing your last meal with a starving stranger brought 200 Apache warriors to your doorstep the next morning? Tell me in the comments from which country or city you're watching us. My name is Samuel Mitchell, and I'm about to tell you the story of how one act of kindness changed not only my life, but the fate of two peoples who had been at war for decades. It all began on what I thought would be my last day as a farmer in the Arizona Territory, when I had nothing left but a single can of beans and more pride than sense. The year was 1879, and I'd been trying to make a living from 40 acres of stubborn desert land for 3 years. When I first arrived in Arizona Territory, I had dreams of green fields and profitable harvests. I'd saved every penny from my years working in the Colorado mines, and I was determined to build something lasting, something I could be proud of. But the desert had other plans. The first year, locusts ate my corn crop. The second year, an early frost killed my wheat. This third year, the worst drought in living memory had turned my fields into cracked, barren earth that looked more like the surface of the moon than farmland. My well had gone dry 2 weeks ago, and I'd been hauling water from a stream 3 miles away just to keep my 2 horses and handful of chickens alive. I'd already sold my plow, my extra tools, and everything else of value just to buy seed for planting. My nearest neighbor, Martha Henderson, lived 15 miles away and had her own troubles. The town of Copper Canyon was a hard day's ride south, and the folks there had made it clear they thought I was a fool for trying to farm in Apache country. "You're wasting your time, Sam," Mayor Stevens had told me the last time I'd gone to town for supplies. "This land wasn't meant for farming. It's meant for dying on." Maybe he was right. As I sat on my porch that October evening, looking out at my failed fields, I was seriously considering giving up. I had enough money left to buy a horse and supplies for the journey back to Colorado, where I could find work in the mines again. It wasn't the life I'd dreamed of, but it was better than slowly starving in the desert. My stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. I walked into my small cabin and opened the cupboard that had once been full of supplies. Now it contained exactly 1 can of beans, a half-empty bag of coffee, and a small piece of salt pork that had seen better days. "Well, Sam," I said to myself, "this is it. Your last supper." I was about to open the can when I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. The soft footfall of someone trying to move quietly across my yard. In Apache country, unexpected visitors usually meant trouble. I grabbed my rifle and moved to the window, peering out through the crack in the shutters. At first, I saw nothing. Then, a shadow moved near my chicken coop, and I caught sight of a figure, crouched low, moving with the fluid grace that could only belong to an Apache. My hands tightened on the rifle. I'd heard stories about Apache raids, about farmers found dead in their fields, about entire families wiped out in a single night. But as I watched, something didn't seem right. The figure was too small, too hesitant. This wasn't the movement of a warrior preparing for attack. This was someone who was scared, maybe even desperate. I kept watching, and gradually I could make out more details. It was a young man, maybe 16 or 17 years old, wearing traditional Apache clothing, but moving like someone who was weak or injured. He wasn't approaching my house or trying to steal my animals. Instead, he was searching the ground near my chicken coop, probably looking for dropped grain or scraps of food. The boy was starving. I'd heard rumors that some Apache bands were having trouble finding food, that the government's efforts to move them to reservations had disrupted their traditional hunting and gathering patterns. But seeing the reality of it, a young man reduced to scrounging for chicken feed, hit me harder than any story. I watched him for another few minutes, seeing the way he moved with careful desperation, checking every corner of my yard for anything edible. Finally, he stopped and sat down heavily against the side of my barn, and I could see his thin shoulders shaking. Whether from cold, hunger, or exhaustion, I couldn't tell. That's when I made the decision that changed everything. I set down my rifle and picked up the can of beans. Then I walked outside, making sure my footsteps were loud enough to announce my presence. The young Apache leaped to his feet, his hand moving to a knife at his belt, but he didn't run. He just stood there, watching me with dark eyes that held a mixture of fear and defiance. "Easy," I said, holding up one hand while keeping the can of beans visible in the other. "I'm not going to hurt you." The boy said nothing, but his eyes never left my face. I could see now that he was indeed very young, probably not much older than 16. His clothes were worn and patched, and his face had the gaunt look of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days. "You hungry?" I asked, holding up the can. He didn't respond, but I saw his eyes flick to the can and back to my face. Of course he was hungry. Anyone could see that. "This is all I have," I said, more to myself than to him. "My last can of beans, but I reckon you need it more than I do." I walked slowly to the fire pit in front of my cabin, aware that the boy was watching my every move. I built up the fire, filled a pot with water from my dwindling supply, and opened the can of beans. As the smell of cooking food filled the air, I saw the young Apache's resolve begin to crack. He stepped closer, then stopped, clearly torn between hunger and caution. "Come on," I said, gesturing to a spot near the fire. "Food's no good if you're too far away to eat it." After a long moment, he approached cautiously and sat down across the fire from me. We didn't speak as the beans cooked, but I could feel him studying me, probably trying to figure out if this was some kind of trap. When the beans were ready, I divided them equally between 2 bowls and handed one to him. He took it without a word, but I saw his hands tremble slightly as he accepted it. "Go ahead," I said, taking a bite from my own bowl. "It's not much, but it's hot." The boy ate slowly at first, as if he were afraid the food might disappear if he enjoyed it too much. But as he realized I wasn't going to take it away, he began to eat with the desperate efficiency of someone who had been truly hungry. I finished my portion and sat back watching him eat. When he was done, he set down the bowl and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Thank you," he said in heavily accented English. "You're welcome," I replied. "What's your name?" "Nalnish," he said after a moment's hesitation. "I'm Samuel." "Sam." Nalnish nodded, then stood up. "I must go. You can stay if you want. It's going to be cold tonight, and I've got blankets." He shook his head. "My people will worry." "Your people?" "My father's band. They camp in the mountains." He gestured toward the peaks, visible in the distance. "Well, be careful out there, and if you ever need food again, you know where to find me." Nalnish studied my face for a long moment, as if he were memorizing it. Then he nodded once and disappeared into the darkness with the same silent grace he'd shown when he arrived. I sat by the fire for a while after he left, thinking about what I'd just done. I'd given away my last meal to a complete stranger, someone who belonged to a tribe that most white settlers considered their enemies. It wasn't the smartest thing I'd ever done, but it felt right. Eventually, I banked the fire and went inside to my empty cabin. My stomach was still hungry, but I felt better than I had in weeks. Maybe it was because I'd finally done something good in this godforsaken place. Or maybe it was because I'd been reminded that I wasn't the only one struggling to survive out here. Either way, I slept better that night than I had in months. I woke before dawn, as I always did, and began my morning routine. I checked on my horses, gathered the few eggs my chickens had produced, and hauled water from the distant stream. It was hard work, and it was getting harder as my supplies dwindled and my strength began to fail. As I returned from the stream carrying 2 heavy buckets, I noticed something strange. There were tracks in the dust around my cabin, lots of them. At first, I thought maybe a herd of deer had passed through during the night, but as I looked more closely, I realized these were horse tracks and human footprints. I set down the buckets and followed the tracks, my heart beginning to race. They led from my cabin toward the fields, and there were so many of them that the ground looked like it had been trampled by an army, which, as it turned out, was exactly what had happened. As I crested the small hill that overlooked my fields, I stopped dead in my tracks. The sight before me was so impossible, so completely unexpected, that I thought I must be hallucinating from hunger. My fields, which had been empty and barren when I'd gone to bed, were now filled with people, Apache people. Men, women and children, all working with quiet efficiency to clear the rocks and debris from my land. Some were digging irrigation channels, others were breaking up the hard-pan soil with tools I'd never seen before, and still others were carrying water in large pottery vessels from sources I didn't even know existed. There had to be at least 200 of them. I stood there, mouth agape, watching as they transformed my failed farm into something that looked like it might actually be able to support crops. They worked with a coordination and skill that spoke of generations of knowledge about this land, knowledge that I'd never had access to. Then I saw him, Nalnish, the young man I'd fed the night before. He was working alongside the others, but when he spotted me standing on the hill, he said something to an older man beside him. The older man looked up, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. Even from a distance, I could see that this was a man of great authority. He carried himself with the bearing of a leader, and the way the others deferred to him made it clear that he was someone very important. He handed his tool to another worker and began walking toward me. As he approached, I could see that he was probably in his 50s, with silver streaking his black hair and lines of wisdom and hard living etched into his face. His clothes were finer than those of the other workers, and he wore several pieces of silver jewelry that caught the morning light. When he reached me, he stopped and studied my face with intense, dark eyes. I felt like I was being evaluated, measured against some standard I couldn't understand. "You are Samuel," he said finally. His English was much better than his son's, though it carried the same distinctive accent. "Yes, sir, I am. I am Cochise," he said simply. My blood turned to ice. Cochise was the most famous Apache chief in the territory, a man whose very name struck fear into the hearts of settlers and soldiers alike. He was a legend, a warrior who had fought the U.S. Army to a standstill and negotiated a peace treaty that allowed his people to remain in their ancestral lands. And he was standing in my wheat field, apparently supervising the restoration of my farm. "My son tells me you fed him last night," Cochise continued. "He tells me you gave him your last food." I looked past him to where Nalnish was working, understanding finally dawning on me. "Your son?" "Yes. And when he told me what you had done, I decided we should return the favor." I gestured toward the workers transforming my land. "All of this for a can of beans?" Cochise smiled, and for the first time I saw warmth in his stern features. "You shared your last meal with a stranger, knowing nothing about him except that he was hungry. You showed honor when you had nothing to gain and everything to lose. I just did what seemed right." "Yes," Cochise said, "you did. And now we do what seems right to us." As I watched the Apache workers continue their labor, I realized that I was witnessing something unprecedented. Here was a people who had been fighting for their survival against white settlers, voluntarily helping one of those settlers save his farm. It was a gesture of respect and reciprocity that went far beyond the simple meal I'd shared. "I don't know what to say," I admitted. "You don't need to say anything," Cochise replied. "Just remember that kindness creates kindness, and hatred creates hatred. You chose kindness. As the morning wore on, I worked alongside the Apache, learning techniques for desert farming that I'd never imagined. They showed me how to build efficient irrigation systems, how to select the right crops for the climate, and how to read the subtle signs that indicated where water could be found underground. But more importantly, they showed me that the divide between our peoples wasn't as wide as I'd believed. We were all trying to survive in a harsh land, all struggling to build something lasting for our families and our futures. As the sun reached its peak, I realized that my life had changed forever. I was no longer just a failed farmer waiting to die in the desert. I was part of something larger, something that might just change the relationship between two peoples who had been enemies for too long. The work continued, and I began to dare to hope that maybe, just maybe, I might actually make it out here after all. Chapter 2. The transformation of my farm took 3 days, and during that time I learned more about the Apache people than I'd learned in 3 years of living in their territory. What I discovered challenged everything I thought I knew about the so-called Apache problem that had been troubling the territory for decades. On the second day, as I worked alongside a group of Apache men to dig a new well, I began to understand the sophistication of their knowledge about this land. They could read signs in the desert that were invisible to me, the way certain plants grew that indicated underground water, the subtle changes in soil color that revealed the best places to plant crops, the patterns of wind and weather that determined when to plant and when to harvest. "Your people have been here a long time," I said to Taza, an older warrior who was supervising the well digging. "Many generations," he replied, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow. "This land is in our blood, as we are in the land's blood. Then why did you never farm it like this before?" Taza smiled sadly. "We did, but differently. We moved with the seasons, took what we needed, let the land rest. Your people want to stay in one place, make the land work harder. Is that wrong?" "Not wrong, just different. Both ways can work, if done with wisdom." As we worked, I began to see that the Apache weren't the savage raiders that government officials and newspaper writers portrayed them as. They were a sophisticated people, with a deep understanding of their environment, complex social structures, and a strong sense of honor and reciprocity. "Why is your chief helping me?" I asked Taza during a break from digging. "Because you showed respect to his son, because you shared food when you had little, because you treated an Apache as a person, not an enemy. But surely one meal doesn't deserve all this work." Taza set down his digging stick and looked at me seriously. "You don't understand. When Nalnish came home that night, he told his father about the white man who gave away his last food to a stranger. Cochise had not heard such a story in many years." "What do you mean?" "Most white men, when they see an Apache, they reach for their guns. They don't see a hungry boy. They see an enemy to be killed or driven away. You saw a hungry boy." As the work continued, I began to form relationships with individual Apache that went beyond the simple exchange of labor. Ayana, a young woman about 20 years old, taught me which desert plants could be used for medicine and which could be eaten in times of scarcity. Geronimo, a skilled warrior whose name would later become famous throughout the territory, showed me how to track game and read the signs that indicated where water might be found. But it was my growing friendship with Nalnish that meant the most to me. The young man had initially been shy and hesitant, but as we worked together, he began to open up about his life, his people, and his dreams for the future. "I want to learn to read," he told me one evening as we sat around a fire, sharing a meal of rabbit stew and cornbread. "I can teach you," I offered. "I have some books in my cabin." His eyes lit up. "You would do that?" "Of course. You've given me back my farm. The least I can do is share what I know." And so began an informal education exchange that would continue for weeks after the initial work was finished. Nalnish would come to my cabin in the evenings, and I would teach him to read and write English while he taught me Apache customs and desert survival skills. On the third day, as the work was nearing completion, I heard the sound of horses approaching from the south. I looked up to see a dust cloud on the horizon, and my heart sank. I recognized the organized formation of the riders. It was a U.S. Army patrol. Cochise saw them too, and I watched as he calmly gave orders to his people. Within minutes, the Apache workers had melted away into the desert, leaving only a small group of leaders to face whatever was coming. "Should I hide too?" I asked Cochise. "No," he said firmly. "This is your land. You stay and speak for yourself." The patrol consisted of about 20 soldiers, led by a man I recognized as Colonel James Harrison, the commanding officer of the nearest army post. Colonel Harrison was a career soldier who had spent most of his adult life fighting Apache, and he had a reputation for being both competent and ruthless. "Mr. Mitchell," Colonel Harrison said as he rode up to my cabin, "we received reports of unusual Apache activity in this area. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Colonel. Better than fine, actually." Now Harrison looked around at my transformed farm, taking in the new irrigation channels, the cleared fields, and the obvious signs of recent intensive labor. "What happened here?" "I received some help with my farming," I said carefully. "Help? From whom?" I glanced at Cochise, who was standing nearby with several of his men. They were clearly Apache, but they were also clearly not posing any threat. Still, I could see the tension in the soldiers' postures, hands moving unconsciously toward their weapons. "From Chief Cochise and his people," I said. "They helped me prepare my fields for planting." Colonel Harrison stared at me as if I'd just claimed to have tea with the devil. "You're telling me that Cochise, the Apache chief, helped you farm?" "Yes, sir. That's exactly what I'm telling you." "Why would he do such a thing?" I looked at Cochise, who nodded slightly, giving me permission to tell the story. "I shared a meal with his son a few days ago. This was their way of returning the favor." Colonel Harrison dismounted and walked closer to me, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Mitchell, do you have any idea who you're dealing with? This man has killed dozens of soldiers. He's been at war with the United States for years." "He's also been helping me save my farm," I replied, "and his people have been nothing but respectful and helpful. This is insane. You're harboring hostile Indians." "I'm not harboring anyone. They're free to come and go as they please." Colonel Harrison turned to face Cochise directly. "Chief Cochise, I'm going to have to ask you and your people to return to your reservation immediately." Cochise stepped forward, his bearing dignified and calm. "Colonel Harrison, we have violated no treaty. We have attacked no one. We have simply helped a neighbor. You're supposed to remain on the reservation unless you have specific permission to leave. The treaty says we may hunt and gather on our traditional lands. We have been gathering knowledge about farming techniques." I had to admire Cochise's diplomatic skills. He was technically correct. The recent treaty did allow for limited movement off the reservation for traditional activities, but he was stretching the interpretation pretty thin. Colonel Harrison was clearly frustrated. "This is highly irregular. I should arrest all of you." "On what charges?" I interjected. "They haven't committed any crimes. They've been helping me work my own land." "The charge would be violating the terms of their confinement." "They're not confined," I said. "They're operating under the terms of a treaty that allows them to hunt and gather on traditional lands." Colonel Harrison looked back and forth between Cochise and me, clearly trying to decide how to handle this unprecedented situation. Finally, he sighed and shook his head. "Mr. Mitchell, I strongly advise you to reconsider this association. These people are dangerous, and fraternizing with them could put you at risk." "Colonel, with respect, the only risk I've faced lately was starving to death on a failed farm. These people saved my life. And what happens when other settlers see Apache working on your land? What happens when they assume you're collaborating with hostiles?" It was a good question, one I hadn't fully considered. The relationship between Apache and white settlers was tense at best, and most settlers would view my cooperation with Cochise as treasonous. "I'll deal with that when it happens," I said, "but I won't turn my back on people who've shown me nothing but kindness." Colonel Harrison mounted his horse and prepared to leave. "This isn't over, Mitchell. I'll be watching this situation closely, and Chief Cochise, I expect you to honor the spirit of the treaty, not just the letter." "I always honor my agreements, Colonel," Cochise replied, "as long as they are honored by your people as well." After the soldiers left, I turned to Cochise. "I'm sorry about that. I didn't mean to cause problems for you." "You didn't cause problems," he said. "Problems already existed. You just made them visible." "What do you mean?" "The colonel is afraid because he doesn't understand what he saw here. He's used to war, not cooperation. This," he gestured toward my transformed farm, "threatens his understanding of the world." "And what about your people? Are they comfortable with this arrangement?" Cochise smiled. "Some are, some aren't. Change is always difficult, but they saw how you treated Nalnish, and they see how you work beside us as equals. That matters more than fear. Over the following weeks, the Apache continued to help me with my farm, though in smaller numbers and with more caution. Word of our cooperation had spread throughout the territory, and reactions were mixed. Some settlers were curious and wanted to learn more about Apache farming techniques. Others were openly hostile, accusing me of betraying my own people. Martha Henderson, my nearest neighbor, rode over one day to see for herself what was happening. She was a tough widow who had been ranching in Arizona for 10 years, and she didn't scare easily. "Sam," she said, looking around at my thriving fields, "people are talking." I figured they would be. "Some of them are saying you've gone native. Others are saying you're putting all of us at risk. What do you think?" Martha was quiet for a long moment, studying the irrigation system that the Apache had helped me build. "I think you've got the best-looking crops in the territory. And I think maybe it's time the rest of us started learning from people who've been successfully farming this land for generations." "You're not afraid." "I'm terrified," she admitted. "But I'm also tired of failing. If working with the Apache means I can actually make a living out here, then maybe it's worth the risk." And so began what I would later think of as the Great Experiment. Gradually, a few other settlers began to approach me, curious about the Apache farming techniques. Some were driven by desperation, others by simple curiosity. But all of them were willing to set aside their prejudices in exchange for knowledge that might help them survive in the desert. Cochise was cautious, but willing to extend the cooperation to other settlers, as long as they showed the same respect that I had shown. Not everyone was ready for such a dramatic change in their relationship with the Apache, but enough were interested that we began to see the possibility of a different future. The turning point came when Mayor Stevens rode out from Copper Canyon with a small delegation of town leaders. I was working in my fields with Nalnish and 2 other Apache when I saw them approaching. "Sam," Mayor Stevens called out, "we need to talk." I walked over to meet them, aware that Nalnish and his companions were watching nervously. "What can I do for you, Mayor? We've been getting reports about your activities out here. Some folks are concerned." "Concerned about what?" "About you working with hostiles, about the message it sends to other Apache bands, about the risk to the community." I looked at my fields, green and thriving for the first time since I'd arrived in Arizona. What risk would that be? The risk that other Apache might see this as weakness, that they might think we're easy targets. Or, I said, they might see it as an opportunity for peace. Mayor Stevens shook his head. "That's a pretty thought, Sam, but it's not realistic. These people are warriors. They don't want peace. They want to drive us out. The Apache working with me want to feed their families just like we do. They want to live in peace on their ancestral lands, just like we want to live in peace on our farms. And what happens when the army decides you're a threat? What happens when they decide that cooperating with Apache is the same as collaborating with the enemy?" It was a question I couldn't answer, because I didn't know the answer myself. But I knew that turning away from the Apache now would be a betrayal of everything I'd learned about their character and their willingness to work toward peace. "I guess we'll find out," I said. As the delegation from town prepared to leave, Mayor Stevens made one final appeal. "Sam, I've known you for 3 years. You're a good man, but you're making a mistake. These people can't be trusted." "They trusted me enough to help save my farm," I replied. "Maybe it's time we started trusting them." That night, as I sat with Nalnish and his father around the fire, I asked the question that had been bothering me for weeks. What happens if the government decides our cooperation is a threat to peace? What happens if they try to stop us? Cochise was quiet for a long time before answering. "Then we will have to decide what matters more, the peace we're building here, or the fear that others have of that peace. And if we have to choose, then we choose based on what we believe is right, not on what others tell us to fear." As I looked around at the faces of my Apache friends, illuminated by the firelight, I realized that we had already made our choice. We had chosen cooperation over conflict, understanding over fear, and hope over despair. The question now was whether the rest of the world was ready to accept that choice, or whether they would try to destroy what we had built together. Chapter 3. The crisis came sooner than I expected, and from a direction I hadn't anticipated. It was late November, and the first real test of our Apache improved farming techniques was showing remarkable success. My fields were green and productive, and I was confident that I would not only survive the winter, but actually turn a profit for the first time since arriving in Arizona. Word of our success had spread throughout the territory, and I was receiving visitors almost daily. Some were curious settlers wanting to learn Apache farming methods. Others were government officials trying to understand the implications of white Apache cooperation. A few were journalists from Eastern newspapers who saw our story as either a heartwarming tale of frontier cooperation or a dangerous example of white settlers going native. But the visitor who changed everything was Dr. William Parker, a physician from back east who had been sent by the Bureau of Indian Affairs to study the health conditions on Apache reservations. Dr. Parker was a good man, with genuine concern for Apache welfare, but he brought news that would threaten everything we had built. "Mr. Mitchell," he said as we sat in my cabin one evening, "I need to tell you something about the young Apache you've been working with. Nalnish. What about him? He's sick. Very sick. He has tuberculosis." The words hit me like a physical blow. Tuberculosis was a death sentence in 1879, especially for someone living in the harsh conditions of the Arizona desert. But more than that, it was highly contagious, and the implications for everyone who had been working with Nalnish were terrifying. "Are you sure?" "I'm afraid so. I examined him yesterday when I visited the Apache camp. The disease is already advanced. He probably has months, not years." I thought about all the evenings Nalnish had spent in my cabin, learning to read and write. All the meals we'd shared, all the close contact we'd had while working in the fields. Could I have caught it from him? "It's possible. You'll need to be examined. But there's a bigger problem." "What?" "The Army is using this as an excuse to shut down all contact between Apache and white settlers. They're claiming that allowing Apache to leave the reservation has created a public health crisis." I felt my heart sink. "They're going to stop the cooperation program?" "They're going to do more than that. Colonel Harrison has orders to return all Apache to the reservation immediately and to prohibit any further contact between Apache and settlers." "But that's not fair. One sick person doesn't invalidate everything we've accomplished." "I agree with you, but the Army sees it differently. They view this as proof that Apache white contact is inherently dangerous." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Nalnish, about his eagerness to learn, about the pride in his eyes when he successfully read his first complete sentence. The thought of him dying alone on a reservation, cut off from the friendships he'd formed, was unbearable. But I also thought about the broader implications. If the Army succeeded in shutting down our cooperation, it would prove to both Apache and white settlers that peaceful coexistence was impossible. It would reinforce the idea that the two peoples were destined to be enemies. The next morning, I rode out to the Apache camp to find Cochise. I found him sitting outside his lodge, looking older and more tired than I'd ever seen him. "You know about Nalnish," I said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, the white doctor told me yesterday." "I'm sorry. I know how much he means to you." Cochise nodded slowly. "He is my youngest son. I had hoped he would live to see the peace we are building. Maybe he still will. Maybe the doctor is wrong." "The doctor is not wrong. I have seen this sickness before. It took my brother 5 years ago." We sat in silence for a while, both of us struggling with the weight of the news. Finally, Cochise spoke again. "The soldiers will come today. They will take us back to the reservation." "And then what?" "Then we will be prisoners again, watched constantly, forbidden to leave even to hunt or gather food." "That's not what the treaty says." Treaties change when it suits the government. You should know this by now. I thought about the months of cooperation, about the friendships that had been formed, about the successful crops that proved peaceful coexistence was possible. There has to be something we can do. What can we do? Fight? That would only prove that the soldiers are right to fear us. No, not fight. Something else. I spent the rest of the day thinking about the problem, and by evening I had an idea. It was risky, probably illegal, and almost certainly doomed to failure. But it was the only thing I could think of that might save both Nalnish and the cooperation we had built. That night, I rode back to the Apache camp and found Cochise. "I have a proposal," I said. "What kind of proposal?" "Bring Nalnish to my cabin. Let me care for him during his illness. If he's going to die, let him die among friends, not as a prisoner on a reservation." Cochise stared at me in surprise. "You would do this, even knowing the risk to yourself?" "Especially knowing the risk. If we abandon each other now, when things get difficult, then we prove that the skeptics were right all along. The soldiers will not allow it. The soldiers don't have to know about it, at least not right away." What I was proposing was essentially kidnapping from the army's perspective, but from my perspective it was an act of friendship and defiance that might preserve the hope of future cooperation. And when they find out, then we'll deal with that when it happens, but at least we'll have shown that our friendship means more than government regulations. Cochise was quiet for a long time, considering my proposal. Finally he nodded. "If this is what you want to do, I will not stop you, but I cannot ask you to take such a risk." "You're not asking. I'm offering." That night, under cover of darkness, Nalnish came to my cabin. He was clearly very ill, thin and pale, with a cough that seemed to shake his entire body. But his eyes were still bright with intelligence and determination. "You don't have to do this," he told me, as I helped him settle into my bed. "Yes, I do. You're family now. Family takes care of each other." For the next several days, I cared for Nalnish while trying to maintain the fiction that I was alone on my farm. It was difficult because his coughing fits were loud and frequent, and I had to be constantly alert for unexpected visitors. Dr. Parker returned on the 4th day, ostensibly to examine me for signs of tuberculosis. But I suspected he also wanted to check on Nalnish, and I was right. "Where is he?" Dr. Parker asked after giving me a clean bill of health. "Who?" "Oti. Don't play games with me, Sam. I know Nalnish is here. I can hear him coughing." I sighed and led him to the bedroom where Nalnish was resting. Dr. Parker examined him carefully, then shook his head. "His condition is deteriorating rapidly. He needs to be in a hospital." "There are no hospitals for Apache," I pointed out. "There are medical facilities at the reservation." "You mean the reservation he's been ordered to stay on as a prisoner?" Dr. Parker looked uncomfortable. "The Army has its reasons for maintaining security. The Army has its fears. That's not the same thing as having good reasons." "What you're doing is illegal, Sam. You're harboring a fugitive. I'm caring for a sick friend. The Army will see it differently. Then the Army can come and arrest me, but I'm not turning Nalnish over to die alone in a government facility." Dr. Parker was quiet for a moment, then surprised me with his next words. "I agree with you." "What?" "I said I agree with you. What you're doing is illegal, but it's also right. This young man shouldn't have to die alone, cut off from the people who care about him." "Are you going to report us?" "I'm going to report that I examined you and found no signs of tuberculosis. What I don't mention in my report is my business." 2 days later, Colonel Harrison arrived with a full patrol. I was sitting on my porch reading when I saw them approaching. I set down my book and walked out to meet them. "Mr. Mitchell," Colonel Harrison said, dismounting from his horse, "I have reason to believe you're harboring a fugitive Apache." "I'm not harboring anyone, Colonel. I'm caring for a sick friend." "The same thing in the eyes of the law." "Then the law is wrong." Colonel Harrison signaled to his men, and they began to search my property. It didn't take long for them to find Nalnish, who was too weak to hide effectively. "There he is," one of the soldiers called out. "He's in the bedroom." Colonel Harrison and I went inside, where we found Nalnish sitting up in bed, his face flushed with fever, but his eyes still defiant. "Young man," Colonel Harrison said, "you're under arrest for violating the terms of your confinement." "He's too sick to be arrested," I protested. "He needs medical care." "He'll receive medical care at the reservation facility." "You mean the reservation prison?" "I mean the reservation, where he belongs." As the soldiers prepared to take Nalnish away, he looked at me with eyes that held both gratitude and sadness. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." "Well, this isn't over," I told him. "I'll find a way to visit you." "No," Colonel Harrison said firmly. "All contact between you and the Apache is now forbidden. Any attempt to visit the reservation will result in your arrest." As I watched the soldiers carry Nalnish away, I felt a deep sense of failure. I'd tried to preserve the friendship and cooperation we had built, and instead, I'd probably made things worse for everyone involved. But that evening, as I sat alone in my cabin, I received an unexpected visitor. Cochise appeared at my door, moving with the stealth that had made him a legendary warrior. "I came to thank you," he said as I let him inside. "Thank me? For what?" "I failed to protect your son." "You didn't fail. You showed honor. You risked everything to care for him when he was sick. That matters more than the outcome. He's going to die alone now." "No," Cochise said. "He's going to die knowing that he had a friend who was willing to sacrifice everything for him. That's not a small thing." We sat in silence for a while, both of us processing the events of the past few days. Finally, Cochise spoke again. "What we built here, it's not finished. It's just delayed." "How can you say that?" "The army has forbidden all contact between Apache and settlers. Armies come and go, fear comes and goes, but the friendships we made, the trust we built, that will last. And someday, when the fear passes, people will remember what we accomplished here." "Do you really believe that?" "I have to believe it, because if I don't, then my son's sacrifice meant nothing." Cochise left before dawn, disappearing into the desert as silently as he had come. I never saw him again, but I would hear news of him from time to time. He died 2 years later, still fighting for his people's right to live freely on their ancestral lands. Nalnish lived for 3 more months, and according to Dr. Parker, who managed to visit him several times, he spent his final days teaching other young Apache to read and write, passing on the skills I had taught him. He died in January of 1880, but his legacy lived on in the students he had taught. As for me, I continued to farm my land, using the techniques the Apache had taught me. My crops thrived, and I gradually became one of the most successful farmers in the territory. But the cooperation that had made it possible was never officially restored. However, Cochise proved to be right about one thing. The friendships we had formed did endure. Over the years, Apache individuals would occasionally visit my farm, usually at night and always in secret. They would share news from the reservation, and I would share what I could in terms of food and supplies. I also began to receive visits from other settlers who had heard about our brief experiment in cooperation. Some were curious about the farming techniques, others were interested in learning Apache languages and customs. Gradually, a quiet network of understanding began to develop, built on the foundation of trust that had been established during those few months of open cooperation. The official policy remained one of separation and suspicion. But underneath the surface, relationships were being built that would eventually contribute to a more peaceful coexistence between Apache and white settlers. I learned that one act of kindness, sharing a can of beans with a hungry stranger, had consequences that extended far beyond what I could have imagined. It had sparked a friendship that transcended cultural boundaries, demonstrated that cooperation was possible even in the most difficult circumstances, and planted seeds of understanding that would grow long after the original participants were gone. Years later, when I was an old man, I would receive a visit from a young Apache teacher who had learned to read and write from students of Nalnish. He brought me a letter written in careful English from the Apache community. "Your kindness to our brother Nalnish is remembered," the letter said. "The lessons he learned from you are still being taught to our children. The friendship you showed to one Apache boy has become a bridge between our peoples that will endure long after we are all gone." And as I read those words, I realized that Cochise had been right. What we had built during those few months of cooperation had not been destroyed by government policy or military intervention. It had been transformed into something more enduring, a legacy of understanding and respect that would influence generations to come. The last can of beans I had shared with a hungry stranger had become the seed of a peace that would outlast us all. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey of how one simple act of kindness sparked a friendship that bridged two cultures. If this story of compassion and understanding moved you, let us know in the comments what moment touched your heart the most. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing Old West stories of hope and human connection.